Hello, everyone. I am just going to double check we're good with audio and video. I've done enough of these to know to check that right off the top. Theon, can you confirm in the chat just that you can hear us? Yep, we're good. And then we'll do a quick check with Ken and Chris as they introduce themselves. So I am John Opperman, Executive Director of Earth Day Initiative. We're a nonprofit organization. We organize large-scale Earth Day events and have a series of sustainability programs throughout the year, and also focusing particularly on how we message climate and sustainability to the public. So let's just do quick intros as well. I always find it's best to have people introduce themselves. They're better than me reading a bio from a paper. So let's do quick intros with folks here. So Ken, do you want to just introduce yourself quickly and sort of describe your expertise on this topic, your background?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of the North American Passive House Network. We are a national nonprofit based here in New York City. And we are provide education and education around advocacy and policy for low energy passive house buildings. We're affiliated with the Passive House Institute, an independent research institute in Darmstadt, Germany, and the global passive house community. And we are interested in implementing buildings that require much less energy, but at the same time provide higher levels of comfort, health, and resilience.
Great, perfect. And Chris?
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Collins, Executive Director at SolarOne. I've been the Executive Director since we started back in 2004. And in that time, we've built three significant programs. One focused basically on education in New York City public schools. And that has focused mostly on solar and energy in the schools. We have a program that goes through all levels of K through 12. Including a program for solar installation as well as green building operations and maintenance training for kids in CTE schools, the career and technical education schools. In 2012, we developed a workforce training program that focuses on green construction, electrical and plumbing, building operations and maintenance, some solar photovoltaic installation training. Last year we trained about 341 people. We have about an 87% placement rate with about a 78% placement retention rate a year later. So we're pretty pleased with those results. And most of our trainees are people who are coming out of the criminal justice system or are formerly homeless or veterans or people who have had challenges in the workplace. And then the most important program we've sort of launched recently has been our Here Comes Solar program. And that's probably the one that's going to be most part of the discussion today from my perspective. And that's a program that facilitates solar adoption in hard to serve markets by providing comprehensive technical assistance to building owners so they can identify and implement cost-effective solar projects. We focus on multifamily and affordable housing. We also are doing resilient solar and battery backup, battery storage, and community shared solar.
Great, sounds good. So obviously your backgrounds are very relevant to the conversation today. That the theme throughout the day for this whole event, Marketplace of the Future, is really about sort of laying out a vision of the future. So what is that future that we would like to see? What are the challenges to getting there? How do we get there? So on the energy subject, we're looking at a couple of different angles. One is energy reduction, just using less energy in general. And then one is making sure that those sources of energy are cleaner and renewable sources. So on that subject, I do want to turn it over to both of you to kind of answer that question that we're answering throughout the day of, okay, what is the goal? Like, what is the vision that would be the ideal in terms of where we're going in the energy space? And Ken, maybe you can lead us off with that, with Passive House, especially describing Passive House, assuming that a lot of our audience members maybe have never heard of Passive House as a concept, which you probably find a lot. So yeah, describing kind of like what is the energy goal here, and with particular regard to the built environment, and how does Passive House achieve that, and sort of what's the goal that you have?
Yeah, and thinking about the vision of this and the task at hand, I also wanted to bring in a little bit more than Passive House, but really Passive House as we see it anchors things going forward. So Passive House is really a building methodology, a way of manipulating the architecture, the building fabric itself, the enclosure, and how that building is going to function in all the passive elements. So things like insulation, things like shading, things like the windows and doors that you're installing, and doing things with an intention and quality that results in up to 90% reduction in the energy required to heat and air condition our buildings, and up to 75% energy reduction in overall energy use. So this is dramatic in setting up a foundation for going to zero energy much more readily and much more robustly. And what's interesting is the same qualities that architects and builders use to manipulate the building fabric to make such an energy efficient building also make it much more comfortable, make it much more healthy interior environment, and more resilient in the case of power outages. You can shelter in place longer and so forth. So it really, it also makes occupancy more affordable because your energy bills are so much lower and carries forward. And so it sets up a place where you have a lot more options in terms of how you are going to fill that energy budget and be more resilient in that way. The part I wanted to add to the Passive House part is also, this idea of carbon, right? That's coupled with energy, and how are cities dealing with the overall carbon issue. And architecture with low energy building is perhaps counterintuitively building out of wood, making the building structure itself negative carbon out of the gate. And so that then you're building a zero energy building, and you have a carbon negative building going forward for many, many, many years, which is absolutely critical. So people don't think about it that much, but the future of cities are cities of wood, and we're building 40-story towers now out of wood, and really anything is possible there. Yeah.
Great. And Chris, do you want to tackle that, sort of what's the ideal vision that you have? And you'll have to unmute yourself. Theon's just going to mute everyone to preserve the audio quality while anyone else isn't talking.
Sorry about that. When I think of the future, I think about transitioning every aspect of our society into an inclusive green economy. And that's, in my mind, we don't have a choice, but two, we have an opportunity, especially now when we look at rebuilding our infrastructure, and we have to do so much of that now, that we rebuild it in a comprehensive way that looks at all aspects of it. And that's everything from transportation to food supply to energy, to water infrastructure, all these different things that, have the side benefit of also employing and putting to work inherently local based jobs and people that could do that work if properly trained. So and that also has to be inclusive and include communities of color and communities that have been traditionally left out of the energy discussion, and who have always suffered the consequences of the energy generation that we've had in the last 100 years. So that's sort of my big picture framework. And then when I look specifically at like energy, I look at the kinds of things that Ken is doing with Passive House structures. I look at things that, we're doing on the renewable side, particularly around solar, wind, biomass, all sorts of different things and technologies. And what's interesting is, for the most part, decarbonizing the atmosphere. Those machines aren't quite ready yet, but for the most part, the technology's here. And all we have to do is figure out how to use it. And it's like I think that's the piece that we have to grapple with. How do we use this technology that's already in front of us, and use it in a very comprehensive, thoughtful way that connects all the dots, creates a circular economy, and reduces the amount of CO2 that we put in the atmosphere.
Could I add? I think one of the things that I find exciting about this energy transition, both on the production and on the efficiency usage side, is the real potential for the accessibility of everyone to partake in it, that we don't need to leave communities behind here. I could speak more personally, around the Passive House side, where affordable housing is a big driver of Passive House construction. It's kind of this oddball thing where you have the first adopters, a more high-end market rate, adopting Passive House for a whole set of reasons. And then you have the affordable housing market wanting to also drive the adoption of Passive House for that security, resilience, affordability, health, and bringing those fundamental qualities. And the trick with Passive House is how do we get it to the middle? And that's kind of our final frontier. But in the context of cities, and in particular New York City, it's very doable because of our density. Multifamily building type, the large institutional and commercial building types makes it so. So we're excited about the fact that we don't see it as niche in its application, that it can go out to everyone.
Oh, Chris, I think you're.
Yep, and yeah. And just to tag on to that, in many ways, solar was like that 10 or 15 years ago. It was really for those who could really afford it, and those who had a lot of money and could put it on their homes. And now what's happened is solar has become much more available. The cost has come down substantially, and the ways of using it have broadened. So that, at Solar One, we do a lot of work on affordable housing. We're doing a lot of work on solar and NYCHA housing. And that, years ago, the numbers never penciled out. Now they pencil out, and they pencil out well. And even post-COVID, we still see an ROI on solar. There's no, there's a lot of financing out there for solar that's making money on it. And that makes it much more available to more people throughout the city. But back to what you were saying earlier, for us, some of the new stuff in energy that I see happening in the future is not just solar, which is a key part of what we do, but battery storage is a new big piece that's just coming to fruition now. We're doing 8 and hopefully 11 sites for the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery and Sandy affected areas on community center type buildings. We're going to be doing solar and battery storage installations, and those will be some of the first battery storage installations in the city. And that's a huge dynamic if we can get a few of these battery storage things working in the city, get the fire department comfortable with it, and get building department comfortable with it, we can really change how New York City uses energy and generates its own energy.
Yeah. Can I throw out one more thought? I think as well, the idea of choice and people being empowered. We see with the electric supply now in our Con Ed bill that you can choose your electric supplier, right? I think that sort of is going to trickle down on the supply side in many ways, where as the generation in New York City in particular is being diversified, but also with buildings. New York City in 2019 passed Local Law 95, which required energy efficiency ratings on buildings. and for over 25,000 square foot and larger, the larger footprint buildings. But like you have a grade for a restaurant, now there are grades for building energy efficiency. And it's something people can recognize and make decisions based on.
Yep. And that same bill also mandated solar or green roofs on new residential and commercial construction, starting to take effect in 2024.
Great.
And one of the things, I do want to come back to the sort of equity and justice issue that you're talking about here, but one of the threads that you have addressed, and I think you would both agree with in both of your respective domains, and that I've heard a lot over and over in the sustainability world, is in many cases the technology is there, and it's just these other barriers that often get in the way, whether it's inertia or policy incentives or entrenched interests or whatever it is. Can you speak a bit to that things have really developed in a promising way, technology-wise, in the energy sphere, whether it's energy efficiency or the sources of energy, but what are those barriers that are still sticking points in your respective domains to really seeing the critical mass shift that we need?
You want to go first, Ken?
Go for it.
Okay. So the two things I think that have happened that are positives are that there are now mandates. So in 2012, when we had a whole bunch of green collar job training money, not a whole lot of green collar jobs emerged because it really came from Washington and it didn't really focus locally. And locally, we now have city and state legislation that are mandating carbon reductions over the next 10 and 20 years. And so that's one big shift. The other shift is that financing is making a lot of these technologies possible as well. So that, people are going to make money on solar, are going to make money on battery storage, are going to make money on all these different kinds of things. I think that's a very different model than we've had up until recently. In terms of the challenges for battery storage, I've already said, I think the challenge there is government regulations. FDNY is still nervous about lithium-ion batteries, even though they're in use in Tokyo, they're in use in all sorts of big cities around the world. And we have many lithium-ion batteries in Tesla cars driving all around the city. So they're understandably concerned about it, but I think those will start to fall away. But right now, that's a big hurdle, and of course, the cost of batteries is still fairly substantial. The other is, I think that there's also a lack of interest or competing interests, especially now. We think about COVID, we think about food security, rent security. How can I be worried about solar energy if if I can't pay the rent, if I can't pay the bills? And part of that is that solar energy will reduce your operating costs so that you can have more money left over to be able to afford to do some of those things that you actually have to do. Obviously, the fossil fuel lobby is a big challenge, and entrenched existing infrastructure, I think, is a big challenge. Doing it the way we've always done it. We have to break through that so that we no longer are just sort of thinking that way, but we're thinking expansively and creatively about, how can we build a better mousetrap?
Yeah, I would add, I agree with all of that. And I think it is exciting to see some of the regulation happening today that is mandating and giving context to these changes and shaping the future in big ways. I think I would add, really just fundamentally, in a way, a lack of imagination that people have. And if I could pin this on the real estate industry, it's very risk averse, right? And what they perceive as risk. And so what they do for the next building that's being developed is based on the one that they just developed and sold. And any change from that, deviation from that is very hard. So you have this railroad effect and you see it. Change is possible in the industry, certainly. But you see one successful building and then there are 10 more just like it. And in that context, it can be it can frustrate the kind of change that we're looking for. That said, I would say the risk profile is changing now. so that you have, like with Local Law 97 in New York City, carbon targets that are quite rigorous for building emissions, going down, that tighten every decade or handful of years. And that's real risk for building owners going forward. And so they need to be planning and thinking about their buildings in a way to minimize that risk, minimize the possible penalties down the road. From a passive house one building on West 29th Street is a 24-story mixed market rate, affordable building called Flow Chelsea. And the owner there, very consciously as part of the calculation, was like, this is going to be lower risk down the road because I know I'm building to this standard. I am locking it in at a low energy and low carbon emissions level. And the amenities, sold the market rate out immediately. And the affordable part is just a matter of going through the process of filling that. But the demand was there, and they see the multiple benefits for that. So we're hoping we have more examples like that, so that the reference points start to shift.
Yeah, and I think to that point about lack of imagination, actually on a panel that I was hosting just a bit ago, I brought up this example too. So apologies to anyone who's seeing multiple panels that I'm moderating, because I just repeat the same thing over and over. But one of the things that reminded me of what I had said earlier when you said lack of imagination in the real estate industry was we were talking about the example of shutting down streets and making them more pedestrian friendly. And people who have experienced that in a lot of parts of the world. New York City, where I'm located, has definitely experienced having restaurants outside and really giving over a lot of the streets to non-car uses. And I had heard at some point during this whole shutdown that apparently whenever a street closure or making a street less car friendly and more pedestrian friendly and turning it over to these other non-car uses is proposed, everyone's against it. Like, no one actually thinks that they're going to like that initially, or a majority of people think that they're not going to like that initially. And then they experience it, and then everyone's on board. So how do we deal with that, and how do you see that in terms of engagement, not just with stakeholders, but I guess the two questions: how do you engage those stakeholders, which in one case would be the real estate industry, in other cases it's city government, it's various people in positions of decision-making power, and then also just the general public. How do you get people excited? Chris, you also alluded to this, that part of the challenge is just a lack of interest. Like, people are worried about a lot of different stuff. How do you make them care about renewable energy and energy efficiency in your respective domains when they have a lot of other stuff going on and it's actually just inertia? But once you get them there, then they're down for it. Do you have anything sort of to speak to that in your respective domains?
Well, from the solar point of view, the single largest determinant as to whether or not somebody will go solar is if they see it on their neighbor's building. Mm-hmm. Once they see it on their neighbor's building, they're like, I want that too.
Yeah.
And so that is actually how we started doing our solar program, was through a Solarize campaign in Brooklyn of brownstone owners. And then eventually we shifted our focus away from that to more of affordable housing. And so where we organize groups of buildings together to purchase, and then we bundle them together and send them out for bid. And so what we're able to do with that is absorb a lot of the pre-development costs that an installer would have in securing customers and doing assessments of the roof and things like that we do for them. And then secondly, because we're bundling buildings together, we're able to actually send them out for bid as a big package that's a much more attractive package to an installer to have a big project than a bunch of small ones. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an interesting perspective when you have it on someone else's house. That's the thing that will drive it. And then the other thing is just the money. If you go to an affordable housing developer and you tell them they're going to save X amount of dollars on an installation over a period of time on their operating budget. Or you tell a co-op owner they're going to be able to reduce their co-op expenses, their common charges, because solar is going to be used in the building. That's a very, the numbers with solar, the numbers are real. You can count to the kilowatt hour exactly what the returns are going to be. We know that information, so there's no mystery to it. And once you convince them that the money works, then it's really an easy sell.
Yeah, and I would add, I'm referring back to, I think Chris mentioned the battery usage in Tokyo, right? And what it takes to get New York on board with that. And like a neighbor, seeing the solar panels on it, like the city to city, what we've found in looking at Passive House and helping drive adoption is to have a friendly sense of competition between cities. And New York likes to think it's the best and greatest and the first of everything. And it's like, hey, but these folks are doing this. Like, maybe we should think about that and get into that. And it actually happened around Passive House in quite interesting organic way, where there was a group of people organized that we were part of, and from New York, Pittsburgh, and Vancouver to go to Brussels, Belgium, and where Brussels was in the process of mandating Passive House for its city building code. And they had an exemplary buildings program where they were promoting, supporting the teams and doing this sort of thing in addition with the code adoptions. And everybody came back to their respective cities kind of blown away and energized to make these changes. And New York City, through One City Built to Last and other initiatives coming through that, was very forward leaning. And working with NYSERDA, they actually developed the Buildings of Excellence program, which then took it more towards the marketplace focus and public focus. So the Buildings of Excellence program was modeled on the Exemplary Buildings program loosely from Brussels. And they just did their first round of awards at the beginning of this year, and supporting big buildings, not all Passive House buildings, but low energy, high performance buildings. Many of them were Passive House. And so you start to see the developers being rewarded, the teams being rewarded, getting that publicity and getting quite a bit of money. I mean, there's serious cash grants involved in that. And so we see that happening. And at the city level, Local Law 31 that was passed in 2016, I want to say, they mandated that the city buildings, many of the city buildings that they were building themselves, would be built to practically the Passive House standard for the low energy. So the school, all of a sudden the school construction authority is like trying to figure out how they're going to meet sort of this low energy standard and do that. And with that, building capacity, building familiarity, seeding the marketplace, allowing that to go. So a lot more public. It's harder, I think, with the public education and how we can promote it and get it out there. But yeah, we need these examples.
There's if I can jump in here, there's a very interesting thing that we noticed. We used to do a lot of energy efficiency work. We did a lot of training and in that area, and we were quite familiar with all the weatherization kind of things being done in buildings and stuff like that. And what we found, oddly enough, was that once you do solar, it's almost like it's the gateway drug for energy efficiency. Yeah. That people put solar on their roofs, and all of a sudden they realize that, oh, I want to really maximize what I'm doing here. So I want to do all the energy efficiency stuff that I can do to make my building tighter and stronger, and use that investment in solar. So it's kind of flipped the model on its head a little bit, because we always thought solar would come after the energy efficiency piece. But in some ways, solar is actually acting as the driver for doing that stuff.
Right, it's the calling card.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, a few different things that you mentioned there. Chris, your point about the most impactful thing is just like your neighbor has solar panels. So that is something that we find a lot with our work at Earth Day Initiative. We have a podcast that we recently launched called the Parts Per Million Podcast, and a large part of that is talking about being a climate communicator, and just the idea that talking about things is actually the most impactful thing that you can do, because your friends and family are way more impactful on you than some PSA or some ad or some article that people read. So that example, the classic example that I feel like everyone on any panel like this cites, but I'm going to do it, is that the most impactful thing to get people to reduce their energy was telling people that their neighbors were reducing more energy than they are, and this like competition mindset. And then to the Passive House point, a lot of folks that I've talked to in the Passive House community, they will tell me the thing that resonates best with people about getting the benefits of Passive House, about it being like energy savings and better for your health and wellness and comfort and all that, is just to experience it. That it all comes down to that personal thing, whether it's you experiencing a Passive House or you experiencing that your neighbor has solar panels. So much of it, it does seem to come down to, it has to be really local to the point of it being about you. I don't know if that's heartening or less heartening, because that's a lot of effort to break through to literally everyone to get them on board. But yeah, what you're saying really resonates with a lot of the work that we do and sort of the themes that I've heard throughout the sessions today. So related to all of this, what I hear you saying throughout this is that there are a lot of positive examples. Can you give some really concrete examples of what you see happening either across the country, it could be in New York City, where I think we're all located, or around the world? It can be cities or organizations or businesses doing things that you find very inspiring, that you think are sort of charting that path forward. This relates to kind of what Ken, you were talking about, that you need those examples. That in the real estate industry, for instance, it's like, yeah, people are just following one in a line, copycatting what people are doing. But then if you provide those positive examples, then you can kind of draw from those lessons learned. But any examples that you think that our audience, which a lot of our audience maybe isn't super well versed in sort of the latest trends in renewable energy or energy efficiency, but what do you think is like cool that's happening out there?
Go ahead, Ken.
I started a couple of ways. I think there are, from the intersection, to return to some of my initial comments, there's this intersection of low energy building and mass wood timber building. And it kind of makes people freak out a little bit when they imagine like the green city of the future. You imagine forests on the buildings, right? And this idea of the landscape enveloping the city, which is definitely very attractive and has a lot of expression and possibility to do, but it's really the building itself being the forest, right? And being that carbon bank, because the buildings made of wood are storing that carbon for the lifetime of the building, and you're regrowing. The wood, of course, has to be grown sustainably, harvested sustainably. You can't short circuit that, but it's huge potential in terms of climate impact. And there are companies out there and architecture firms like Michael Green, architects in the Pacific Northwest, Katerra, which is out of the West, but they're a big national company, looking at bringing technology, prefabrication, mass wood construction, super low energy building all together, and making it really viable in the marketplace. That's a company. I think the sort of housing financing and the mechanisms that are happening around that, and moving money and resources that is allowing affordable housing to really be at the vanguard of these developments is super exciting. And to see that it's going across all communities. And you have municipalities like Brussels, which I mentioned, which is just astounding what they did over a series of years with pilot projects and proving the concept. They thought when the law actually passed, there would be a revolution in the streets, and it didn't happen. The industry adapted. They can do it. It's not rocket science. And they've shown that you can have that transformation. And Brussels was not like this magical, people think like, oh, it's the German, work, artisan work craft that's making this all possible. Brussels had just as bad a building stock as any American city could appreciate, and showing that as possible. I think that's the really exciting thing. Yeah, I'll leave it there for the moment.
On the renewable side, New York really has become a leader in this stuff. So I don't look too far because I think we're doing some really, really interesting cutting edge stuff here in New York. And that's because it took years to get a lot of the regulations in place to be able to drive this kind of change. But the two things that are really interesting to me are the whole idea of community shared solar, and as well as cooperative ownership. So let me talk about the first one, community shared solar. We're doing a project with Con Ed. It's a REV demonstration project with Con Ed. And we're doing it on 3 NYCHA complexes, about 40 buildings. We have 2 on-the-ground partners, environmental justice partners. We Act for Environmental Justice and the Brooklyn Movement Center are involved in it. And Green City Force is involved in it. And what we're doing is it's a 1.2 megawatt series of installations on NYCHA housing. It will be for the benefit of NYCHA residents or people living in Section 8 housing immediately adjacent to NYCHA residents, NYCHA complexes. And it will enable, we're also going to, there's a training component. We're going to hire 15 18 to 24-year-old NYCHA residents to do the installs, train them up in solar installation, to actually work with the installer that we've hired as a minority firm that's doing the installations. And what it does is it enables 350 NYCHA residents to share in the energy that's generated by the systems on those NYCHA complexes. And so they'll get a credit on their energy bill directly from that system. And it's a little different from what we've gotten used to, which are sort of green energy companies that provide green energy from some source that may be outside the city. This is going to be right here in New York City. And it's really, it doesn't have to be brought in from anywhere else. So there's a loaded set of benefits on this. The other one that we're doing is on the Brooklyn Army Terminal. And we're working with Uprose in Sunset Park and a number of other partners. And the idea there is that in the early years, the system will be owned by tax equity investors and developers or lender. And then around year 5 or 6, the system will convert and flip into a cooperative ownership by members of a local community co-op based, local based co-op, the New York City Energy Co-op. And it's being set up very much as like a food co-op, like agricultural food co-ops in rural areas that work really well. We're bringing that same concept into New York City, into energy. And the result is that the local community in Sunset Park, when in year 6 or 7, that system will become a cooperatively owned system that they will then own. And that's a really unique and different kind of approach to how we generate energy and how we're going to use it. And we're going to look at this as kind of a model to see whether or not it works and whether or not we can expand it. But I think those are 2 really sort of exciting developments in New York City that are going to expand the market.
Yeah, I would just further acknowledge and want to that New York State and New York City in particular are really are big leaders, not just in the United States, but globally at this point. And it's really exciting to see what's going on. There's a lot more to do, obviously, but there's been a really clear path, or the path is becoming clearer in terms of how we're going to get there. And over the last few years, a lot of the key players have really come together to help make that happen. So we should see it.
The other part there is we have the mandates. The mandates have been set up at the state and the city level, but NYSERDA and the state have allocated billions, literally billions of dollars towards clean energy initiatives. And NYSERDA administers that program. And NYSERDA, let's not forget, NYSERDA, because of the way it's structured, is not subject to the normal legislative budgetary process. Their funding comes from a whole different source, and they're not part of that normal budgeting process. So even with the tight budgets we're going to experience over the next few years, NYSERDA's funding is through different mechanisms, and that funding should continue. And I don't see any reason why it wouldn't. And we're talking billions of dollars of investment.
Yeah.
And that's on the government capital side. And then you start looking at what the return on investments are for the private capital side. And it's pretty substantial, and they know it, and they're starting to flow money into it.
Yeah, and Chris, I'm glad that you brought up community solar because I think that is something that a lot of people have not heard of. But whenever I describe that to people, it's really captivating because so much of the population, especially people in a place like New York City, I always describe New York as a high ambition, low ability city when it comes to renewable energy traditionally, and that it's a very progressive population. People would love to switch over to solar, but there's a belief that you can't because people are like, I rent or I live in an apartment building, so I can't just run up to the roof and put solar panels on the roof. But when you describe to people that you can actually be a part of a solar project without any installation, it is really mind-boggling to people. And I think it's just this breakthrough that I was really happy when I saw a lot of the folks trying to bring community solar to New York City. They had some challenges early on in terms of, I feel like it took a while to figure out the infrastructure of how do we actually put solar panels in a place like New York City where the land is taken up, and how do we actually operate on roofs when sometimes the infrastructure doesn't really support it. But I think it's been really interesting. One challenge that I have seen in communicating this stuff to the public, back to our point earlier about how do you get buy-in, is it is a really difficult concept to wrap your head around, just the electricity supply in general. It is very complicated, I feel like, for a lot of people to understand, okay, this is how it all plays together with energy sources coming from here, and then it gets over here, and it gets to the end user. That we at Earthly Initiative, we've had long conversations with people describing community solar because we have our own projects where we're signing people up for community solar. And after talking to them for like 20 minutes and you think that they grasp the idea of it, they're like, awesome, I'm gonna go talk to my landlord and see if we could put solar panels on the roof. And you're like, oh my God, I thought I thought that we had gotten across the point that you don't have to do that, that it's all taken care of. So it is really difficult to convey, but another positive development when you do get through to people that I've been really happy about is the equity and justice issues that we were talking about and that you were talking about with your community solar projects that you're a part of, Chris, that in a lot of cases, you know, people always assume the more sustainable option in general, and with renewable energy, it has been the case, it's going to be more expensive. But now that is not the case, that a lot of the community solar projects, if not most of them that I'm aware of, you actually save money from joining the community solar project, which is great because it just takes away that barrier that was really a separator before.
I think that's absolutely right. It's a very simple concept that got really complicated because the way the state set it up, it assumed that it was going to be big solar farms in upstate New York, and people could participate in the return on those big solar farms. And when we got it down here in New York City, we were sort of scratching our heads and trying to figure out, okay, we don't have a lot of really big buildings in New York City, but we do have a lot of buildings. We have big flat rooftop spaces in Queens and Long Island City and Brooklyn. But at the time, everybody was holding on to their rooftop space because they didn't know if they might get rezoned, and all of a sudden their building might be worth a whole lot more than it currently was. So they didn't necessarily want to tie up their rooftops. So we started thinking about, okay, how do you do this in a way that maximizes it for individual buildings? And so we started initially with the HDFC buildings, the lower moderate income housing. They're cooperative homes, and we would bundle those buildings together, and the savings actually went to the co-op owners, right? So the co-op owners, they may not get 100% offset against their energy use in the building, but they'll get some of it. And that became our model for community shared solar, was within a cooperative building itself, with a rooftop array. And then we extrapolated from that to other kinds of projects, like the NYCHA Housing Project and like the Brooklyn Army Terminal Project, that are using public buildings for the benefit of the local community.
Yeah.
Can I just add one quick comment related to cost?
Yeah.
So, because I think people also think when you're talking about passive house and high performance building and low energy specialty building, that this must be unaffordable and just the costs are too much. And it's really not the case. And particularly, I mean, it has a curve to it, right? An adoption curve, like any technology. Initially, it's going to be quite a bit more. There are fewer players, fewer options, less knowledge base around it. But we actually have now 10 years of experience with it in New York. And we have a range and a scale of projects going on. And what we see is that passive house is not materially significantly driving the cost of these projects. That there are so many other factors going on that are really what is deciding on where the project cost base is landing, that it is fundamentally affordable and doable for the vast majority of the projects that we see happening in New York. And that's from the affordable to the townhouse retrofits to the new apartment buildings in Midtown.
Yeah. And I think, Ken, we might have talked about this the other day, just the full range. I find it really interesting that you see passive house and high performance buildings happening at the very, very ultra high end over to affordable housing. And they've both really taken off, or not both, but I guess everything in between. That it has been really interesting that it's actually kind of been everything at once, in my opinion.
Right.
Did you have
what's ironic is that because people think of passive house, because of the language, they automatically think of a single family house, which is not where it came from and is not what it's about. And the fact of the matter is that a single family house is actually the hardest thing to make a passive house. The multifamily and other buildings, it's much easier, the economics and the design and all the different things you need to deal with, much more straightforward. So it's just one of those twists of life.
Yeah, I mean, sustainability in general and climate change communications and the whole environmental sphere is full of unfortunate messaging. And it's a lot of landmines. So I do want to circle back to one thing that you had talked about, because someone had submitted a question asking you about the use of wood as a material. And then you subsequently largely answered that question, but there was one aspect to it that I wanted to make sure that you also addressed. Part of that question was, why is the choice of wood as a material for building as opposed to everything else out there? And that was one thing. Could you speak to that everything?
Sure.
Like, why is everything else so much worse in terms of energy use?
So what we're talking about is a term called embodied carbon, which is the amount of energy and carbon emissions that are put into the manufacture and delivery of that building material to the job site and getting it into use. For steel and concrete, it's generally much, much higher amount of energy to produce those materials and get them up on the job site. And so you have much higher carbon emissions. That's the one side. And then you have the added benefit on the other side of the ledger, which the wood is not only has relatively low manufacturing energy expense and carbon emissions, but now you have a carbon storage material that then makes the building effectively negative carbon in terms of its long-term environmental impact. So it has a double benefit in that way. And the typical construction, we can make lower carbon concrete, and companies are looking to do that. Another great example, like Skanska, big global sustainable construction company. You know, concrete's one of those things. It's like cooking. You can substitute ingredients, and some ingredients cost more. Some ingredients have more calories. Some ingredients have less calories, or fat, or whatever carbohydrates, whatever you're counting. And they change the mix of the concrete, and it drives down the carbon, the embodied carbon. So wood is very positive in that regard.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. So closing out, we don't have a ton of time. If anyone does have questions, you can still hit them in the Q&A, which actually I just saw one pop up. Will the recording of today's events be available for future viewing? Yes. So I know Earth Day Initiative, we will be sharing out these videos as soon as they're available. So you can check our email list at earthdayinitiative.org. Check us on social. We'll be sharing them there. Also at Earth Day Initiative. We can put you in touch with the folks from Marketplace of the Future, the organizers here. I don't know their email off the top of my head, but I am sure that they're going to be sharing them out. But if you get in touch with us at Earth Day Initiative, we're happy to share the Marketplace of the Future contacts as well. So closing out, the typical thing that I always see coming from panels like this, anytime I sit at a panel or any attendee is sitting here, it's like, okay, but now what? So what do I do? Like, I want to be part of the solution. What is one, maybe a couple of simple things that people could do related to energy, whether energy reduction or renewable energy, that people can do and feel like they really are making a positive impact?
Want to go, Chris?
Sure. I think there's a few things people can do that are simple and not very, and probably cost effective. One is to see if you can find a community shared solar project that's going on, and see if you can register for that, because you will get the benefit of probably about a 10%, 15% benefit from that system on your electric bill. So that's one thing you can do. And then, I mean, I think I'm trying to think of things that are not terribly expensive. I mean, certainly people can go out and if you're in low and moderate income housing, you can reach out to Solar One, and we will assess your property and let you know whether or not we think it's viable for solar. I guess the other thing is, I was just thinking practically the other day about what people can do, and I think we forget that, you know, they're very simple things. You can volunteer in a park for a day. We manage a park over in the East River, Stuyvesant Cove Park, and you know, all the parks are closed for 3 months, and they're just overrun with weeds and all sorts of stuff. And the need for volunteers is great. And most parks are open spaces, and they're COVID compliant, and they're socially distant, and they have masks and gloves and things like that. So that's something I think is important for everybody to think about doing, just to get outside and do something different and get out of this crazy Zoom environment we've been living in for the last 6 months. And I guess the two other things that are practical things that people can do is fill out your census form, which I understand has been extended through the end of October, and vote. Those are the two most important things you can do. I'm a person.
Great points. I would say that in a couple of different situations in living and working, like if you are looking for a place to move your business or where you live, you're going to move your home, and you're looking at big buildings, look for that energy efficiency rating. And like you don't necessarily want to eat in a restaurant that's a B or a C. You wanted to look for that A rating and for the energy efficiency in the building. If you're in a co-op building or a condo building or work in an office building, speak to the building supervisors, the supers, the management. What are they doing to make it a more energy efficient building? There's a lot of things going on and there are incentives out there for the building to take advantage of. If you have some control over your own building too, or your own space, you know, basic weatherization techniques are very approachable in terms of air tightness, insulation, and things like that. And, you know, we learned in the pandemic, I think many, that it was the Spanish flu that caused us to have all these oversized radiators in New York City, so the story goes, so that people could have their windows open and have the fresh air ventilation and not freeze. So that's why we all have to open our windows, because that's the way it was designed to be comfortable. Consequently, and I didn't mention in my bio that I was an architect as well and working as an architect for many decades and our 2 decades. And one thing we would always do in these overheated apartments is just remove the radiators because you didn't need them to be comfortable. With a little air sealing and a little weatherization, you can remove the radiators. The risers will heat and the building from itself will heat, and you'll have greater comfort. If you are renovating, if you own a building or a structure of some kind and you're renovating, don't just do the passive house approach is to do, say, you're either gut renovating it to a high standard, or if you're doing it piecemeal, step by step, don't do the thing necessarily that just matches the existing poor performance of the building. Do the best thing that you can do. And it may not in isolation, like economically pay for itself, but step by step, you raise the performance of the building and you have a high performance building down the road. It requires some long-term planning. It's pretty specific, but very doable, and it has been done. And then finally, if you're building something new, whether it's a home, a multifamily, whatever it is you may be doing, to look to strategies like passive house and then integrating renewables and all the other things so important to zero energy and negative carbon future.
Great, thank you. Those are perfect points to end on, I think. And we do have one more question that I just wanted to address really quickly. So the question about community solar being available in more suburban environments. Yes, a lot of parts of the country do have community solar programs. It actually took off in a lot of parts of the country before New York because other parts of the country don't have the same land restrictions or sort of limitations rather that New York City has. If you email us, someone from our team will try to pass some resources along to you. So if you just go to earthdayinitiative.org, shoot us an email and someone will try to gather some resources. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much to Chris and Ken. I think we're officially the last panel of the day. So thank you for closing it out.
Thanks, John.
And yeah, check us out at Earth Day Initiative for more information. We'll be sharing this stuff if you want a recording of this or if you want to pass it on to anyone else. I really appreciate you joining us. This was a really fun conversation. And I will talk to you soon.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.